Imagine watching strangers build 35 homes on land. Your grandfather bled to protect, every letter ignored, every door slammed in your face. Until one stormy night you turned the wheel on the dam. They forgot you still owned. Roland Drexel never forgot the sound. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't machinery. It was water angry, alive and unstoppable, pouring across streets that only weeks before hadn't even existed. And at the center of it all stood Roland, a man most of his new neighbors had ignored, forgotten, or outright dismissed. To them, he was just a middle-aged landowner, clinging to old property to him. That land was bloodline memory and promise, and when they built over it without his permission, they triggered something they didn't expect, a reckoning carried by the current of a dam they never bothered to ask about. The story of Roland Drexel isn't fiction. It could be anyone's story, in a country where land and legacy collide with greed and power. Picture a stretch of farmland just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. Green fields sloping toward a modest creek and tucked behind a tree line. A dam built decades ago by Roland's grandfather. This dam wasn't some grand structure of stone and steel. It was practical, small, but strong, enough to keep the Drexel family crops watered. Through dry seasons, it was also a symbol, proof that his grandfather had claimed his place in a world that tried to push him aside. When Roland inherited the acreage at 58, he wasn't thinking of subdivisions or development deals. He thought of his father's weathered hands, pointing out the property lines, of childhood summers, chasing fireflies across the field, of the dam his grandfather maintained with his own sweat. For Roland, this wasn't just soil and water. It was permanence in a county that had always whispered that families like his didn't belong. But permanence has a way of being tested. Roland had barely settled into retirement when the letters started showing up. They came from the Bradford Creek Homeowners Association, signed at the bottom by Marjorie Kellerton. The HOA president, the letters were polite at first, written in that tidy, corporate tone that sounds friendly, while saying something very different. Your land is underutilized. One read another suggested that Roland might consider partnership opportunities with developers who could maximize the potential of the property. Roland crumpled those letters and tossed them into the kitchen trash. To him, it wasn't even worth responding, but those letters were only the first rumble before the storm. Weeks later, Roland noticed survey stakes in the ground, thin wooden poles with orange ribbons flapping in the breeze, marking territory like a warning. He called the county office. They put him on hold. He called again. This time, an assistant promised to look into it, but nothing stopped, and then one morning, he woke to the roar of bulldozers. From his porch, Roland watched as workers drove heavy equipment across his land, carving out dirt roads where cattle once grazed. He walked straight to the site, boots sinking in the mud, waving his arms at the crew. "This is my property," he shouted. A man in a hard hat just looked down from the cab of his machine and shrugged. Another pointed him toward a laminated permit, stapled to a wooden stake. The name on it wasn't Drexel. It was Kelton. Roland's voice cracked with fury. "You can't just take this," he shouted. "The foreman, a stocky man with a clipboard." You reply without even looking up? "Sir, you'll need to bring that up with the HOA." By the time Roland reached the HOA office, tucked inside a newly built strip mall, Marjorie Kelton was waiting for him. She had sharp blonde hair cut just above her shoulders, pearl earrings in a tone that was somehow both polite and condescending. "Mr. Drexel," she said smoothly, "we've been over this. The land wasn't being used to its full potential. We had approvals, the community needs housing, and your acreage was the perfect fit." Roland leaned across her desk, his hands trembling with rage. "That land was my father's, my grandfather's. You don't get to decide what it's worth." Marjorie didn't blink. She clasped her hands and leaned back in her leather chair. "With all due respect, Mr. Drexel, progress doesn't wait for nostalgia." Those words cut deeper than any blade nostalgia. shingled 35 homes rose in quick succession. Each one, a reminder that Roland's history was being erased. In real time, the county officials shrugged, saying the paperwork was in order. The neighbors whispered that he was making a fuss, and through it all, Marjorie Kelton smiled, as if everything were proceeding exactly as it should. But there was one thing no one seemed to remember, one detail they overlooked in their rush to build and pave and claim behind the trees. Behind the fences, the dam still stood. It was old, yes, but it was solid. And more importantly, it still belonged to Roland Drexel. But if the bulldozers had shaken Roland's patience, what came next would test his breaking point. Long before the sound of bulldozers or the sight of orange survey stakes, Roland Drexel's land carried the weight of a story. Not the kind written in books, but the kind that gets passed down through kitchen table conversations and quiet moments between fathers and sons. His grandfather, Isaac Drexel, bought the land in 1948, 40 acres just outside Fayetteville, North Carolina, back when black families, owning large tracts of land in that county, raised eyebrows and stirred resentment. People told Isaac he wouldn't last 5 years before the banks, so the county found a way to push him off. But Isaac was stubborn. He cleared the fields, planted corn, and built a dam along the creek, so the crops would never go thirsty. That dam became more than stone and water. It would survive in hot Carolina summers, when neighbors' fields browned under the sun. Isaac's corn stayed green. That dam fed not just crops, but the entire Drexel household. It was proof that, no matter how much pressure the world applied, the family could hold their ground. Roland grew up hearing his grandfather's stories. He remembered sitting on a weathered porch swing, with Isaac watching the water trickle past. Isaac's voice was grayly but steady when he said, "This land will test you, boy. It'll try to make you doubt it's yours. But you remember your hands worked this ground. Your name holds this ground. Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words didn't mean much to a boy chasing fireflies, barefoot across the grass. But they meant everything to the man Roland became. Because as he got older, Roland saw just how often his grandfather had to defend that property a neighbor once tried to claim. The boundary line was farther east. The county tax office accidentally doubled his assessment one year. But every time Isaac fought back, often with little more than persistence and a deep, gravelly laugh, that unnerved those who underestimated him. When Isaac died, the land passed to Roland's father, Victor Drexel, who carried on the same way. Victor didn't expand the farm, didn't chase new ventures, didn't see the land as something to flip or sell to him. It was a legacy to maintain, like a torch he would eventually hand down. Roland spent his teenage years repairing fences, clearing brush, and hauling water buckets during dry spells, while other kids his age dreamt of leaving small towns behind. Roland understood the land was in his blood, so when Victor passed away, the property finally became Roland's. There was no hesitation. He didn't see it as a burden. He saw it as continuity. Standing at the edge of the dam that morning, the sun glinting off the reservoir, he felt the weight of 3 generations pressing into his shoulders. He whispered out loud, "I'll keep it standing." That promise carried him into retirement. Roland had worked nearly 3 decades as an electrical engineer at a plant near Durham, saving diligently, never spending more than he needed. Retirement wasn't supposed to be about battles. It was supposed to be about walking the land at sunrise, repairing small things at his own pace, maybe leasing out part of the field for hay. He even imagined teaching his niece's kids how to fish at the creek, the same way his grandfather had taught him. But dreams like that rarely survive when progress comes knocking. It started with strangers, parking their trucks near his property line. At first, Roland thought they were hunters or surveyors from the county. Then he saw the tripods at the measuring wheels, the laser levels flashing red beams across his field. He walked down to confront them, hands on his hips. "Morning," Roland said. "You mind telling me what you're doing on my property?" One of the surveyors, a young man in a neon vest, didn't look up from his clipboard. Just marking boundaries for the new development. Roland's brow furrowed. New development, this land isn't for sale. The young man finally glanced up, frowning as if Roland were the one trespassing. You'll have to take that up with the host, sir. We're just contractors. Roland's chest tightened to words. New development clanged in his ears like church bells. He went home that night and rummaged through his father's old lockbox, pulling out every deed and record he could find. Piece of paper confirmed what he already knew. Drexel still owned every acre. His name was there written in ink. Notarized stamped his land. When he told his sister Bernice what was happening, she looked at him with disbelief. Roland, that can't be right. Nobody can just walk in and take what's yours. Roland sighed, rubbing his temples. You'd think, but they're not asking. They're just building. Bernice's voice hardened. Then you need to remind them who that land belongs to. But as weeks rolled forward, the reminders didn't matter. Paper meant nothing against concrete being poured and houses going up. The more Roland tried to assert his claim, the more invisible he became. And yet every night when he walked past the dam, he felt the same steady current. His grandfather once relied on. It was still his, the water, the reservoir, the control. No surveyor's stake could change that. But while Roland clung to his inheritance, another figure was preparing to challenge it head-on. Marjorie Kelton. If Roland was the type of man who spoke with patience, thought before he acted, and measured his words like they carried weight, Marjorie Kelton was the opposite. She filled silence before anyone else could. She was polished, quick to smile in public, but sharp, enough to cut through anyone who disagreed with her. In private at 52, she had spent nearly 2 decades climbing the social ladder of Bradford Creek Estates, the kind of neighborhood where HOA bylaws seemed as sacred as scripture. Her background wasn't farming or engineering. Marjorie came from real estate, a business where land was nothing more than inventory, and character was measured in square footage. She wasn't malicious, in the way a villain might be in a movie. At least not in her mind. She saw herself as a builder, someone shaping communities of the future. But to those who crossed her, the polished veneer of her smile barely hid a streak of arrogance. The first real conversation between Roland and Marjorie happened in that small HOA office, a converted dental clinic, wedged between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner. Roland had stormed in after watching bulldozers chew through the soil that once fed his grandfather's corn. His voice was still hoarse from shouting over engines when he slammed his palms down on her desk. You're trespassing, Roland barked. That land is mine and I have the paperwork to prove it. Marjorie leaned back slowly, folding her hands together, like she was the only adult in the room. Mr. Drexel, I understand you're upset. Change can be difficult, but this project was carefully approved through all the proper channels. The community voted, the permits are signed. Roland's jaw tightened. I never signed anything. My family never sold an acre. For a flicker of a moment, Marjorie's smile wavered, but she recovered quickly, tilting her head as though explaining something simple to a stubborn child. The county determined the land wasn't being used productively. You weren't farming, you weren't developing, you weren't building. It's called eminent domain. Mr. Drexel, it happens all the time. Roland leaned closer, his voice dropping low and steady. That land has been ours for 70 years. My grandfather built that dam with his own hands. Don't you dare call it unused. Marjorie's lips tightened into a polite line. And yet, Mr. Drexel, look outside. Families need homes. Children need schools. Communities need growth. Sometimes history has to make room for progress. The words history has to make room echoed in Roland's chest like a warning. He realized in that moment Marjorie wasn't going to be reasoned with. She didn't see the Drexel land as legacy. She saw it as leverage. Over the next few weeks, Roland saw her fingerprints everywhere. At town meetings, she stood at the podium with glossy brochures, showing artists' renderings of tidy cul-de-sacs, children riding bikes, and dog walkers smiling under street lamps. She spoke with the confidence of someone who assumed everyone agreed with her already. This development, she declared in one meeting at the county hall, will bring new families, new jobs, and new tax revenue. It's exactly what Cumberland County needs. From the back of the room, Roland shouted, "That's my property." Heads turned. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, embarrassed by the confrontation. Others whispered, dismissing him as a crank, unwilling to let go of the past. Marjorie, unshaken, simply raised her voice. "The paperwork is in order. The county approved it. Progress is never easy, but it's always necessary." Later outside the meeting, Roland cornered one of the county commissioners, a man named Douglas Reeves, who shuffled nervously with a briefcase in his hand. "You know that land is mine," Roland said, his voice hard. Reeves avoided his eyes look. "Mr. Drexel, I sympathize. But once these things get moving, it's hard to stop. You'll be compensated fairly. Maybe not what you wanted, but fair." Roland stared at him, his fist clenched. "You can't put a price on history." Reeves sighed, murmured something about bigger forces at play, and hurried to his car. That was the moment Roland realized the machinery wasn't just physical. It was political. The system wasn't built to hear him. It was built to keep people like Marjorie comfortable and people like him invisible. Back at the HOA office a week later, Roland tried once more. He brought his niece, Tanya, with him, hoping another voice would break through Marjorie's walls. Tanya was fiery, younger, less willing to bite her tongue. "My uncle has the deed," Tanya snapped, slamming the documents on Marjorie's desk. "You're trespassing, you're stealing." Marjorie glanced at the papers without touching them. "Those documents are outdated. We need to take it up with the courts." Meanwhile, construction continues. Roland's chest burned. "You're gambling with something you don't own." Marjorie finally stood, her smile tightening into something colder. "Mr. Drexel, let me be clear. The community voted for me to lead, and I will, or you can spend the rest of your days clinging to a crumbling dam. Or you can move on. The choice is yours." Her words landed like a stone in Roland's gut. For the first time, he saw not just arrogance, but calculation. Marjorie didn't slip. She didn't stumble. She meant every word. She was daring him to give up. But Roland wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. He knew what was coming, and as construction accelerated, so did his resolve. The sound of machinery became the new alarm clock on Roland Drexel's land. Sunrise used to mean the call of meadowlarks and the steady trickle of water spilling from the dam. Now it was the grind of backhoes, the slam of dump trucks, and the staccato hammering of nail guns. Every morning, Roland walked to the edge of his property, boots sinking into damp earth, and watched as strangers reshape the soil that had once carried his grandfather's sweat. The first houses went up, faster than he could have imagined. What began as a dirt road carved across his pasture soon sprouted foundations. Within days, road frames reached skyward like skeletons, wrapped in sheets of plastic, bearing the logo of a construction company he had never heard of. It felt like time was moving at double speed, his inheritance swallowed in fast motion while he stood rooted to the ground. Neighbors began driving by just to gawk. Some slowed their cars, rolled down their windows, and nodded approvingly at the rows of new homes stretching across the horizon. One evening, Roland overheard a conversation. Outside the corner gas station, those new builds looked sharp, a man said, leaning against his truck. "Yeah," another replied, sipping a soda. "HOA says prices will jump as soon as they're finished. Great investment for the neighborhood." Roland cleared his throat, stepping into their line of sight. "That investment was my family's land. They didn't ask, they didn't buy. They just took it." The two men exchanged a quick glance. The first shrugged. "Look, man, progress is progress, can't stop it." Roland felt his stomach knot, the same way it had when county officials brushed him off to everyone else. These were just houses, new lawns, new driveways, new promises of property value. To him, they were trespassing monuments. It wasn't just the sight of the homes. It was the small humiliations, too. Workers parked their trucks on his grass, leaving ruts like scars delivery vans rumbled past, carrying stacks of roofing shingles. Once Roland found a group of construction workers sitting on his porch steps during their lunch break, unwrapping sandwiches and laughing, like it was their place he told them to leave. One of them chewing with his mouth open smirked. "Relax, old man. Soon this will all be part of the neighborhood anyway." That line followed Roland home like a curse. The new residents began moving in before the development was even finished. Young couples with toddlers, families with dogs, retirees looking for quiet cul-de-sacs. They waved at Roland when they saw him, assuming he was just a neighbor, not the man whose land they were standing on. One woman even walked over one afternoon, introducing herself cheerfully. "Hi, I'm Angela Roland. We just moved into Lot 12. Isn't this area wonderful?" Roland stared at her silent for a moment, then answered in a low voice. "It was before they built over my field." Angela blinked, her smile faltering. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize." She trailed off, adjusting her sunglasses and retreating toward her driveway. Without another word, but not everyone was polite. At a neighborhood gathering, organized by Marjorie Kelton herself, Roland showed up to make his case directly. Families spread out folding chairs in the cul-de-sac. Kids darted around with popsicles. Marjorie stood near a portable speaker, clipboard in hand, greeting residents with the warmth of a campaigner. When Roland approached, the chatter dimmed. "Mr. Drexel," Marjorie said, her voice carrying over the crowd, "we didn't expect you tonight." Roland's chest tightened. "Didn't expect me? You're building on my land. You should expect me every day." Murmurs rippled through the group. A man in a polo shirt whispered to his wife, "Isn't this that guy who keeps complaining?" Roland lifted his voice, his hands trembling. Not with age, but with fury. "This development is built on theft. My grandfather cleared this ground. My father kept it alive. And you people treat it like a blank slate." To scribble on, Marjorie smiled tightly. Stepping closer, "Mr. Drexel. Please, we've been through this. You're distressing the community with your accusations. Everyone here deserves peace in their homes." Roland stared at her, his jaw clenched. Peace doesn't come from stealing. It comes from respect. The silence that followed was thick. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, while others avoided his gaze. Marjorie seized a pause to redirect. "Let's all remember," she said brightly. "We're building a future here, Holmes. Family safety. And sometimes, building the future means leaving the past behind." Roland turned on his heel and walked away, but the words clung to him like burrs. Leaving the past behind. That was her way of saying his history didn't matter. That night back at the dam, Roland sat on the embankment as the water rippled under moonlight. He ran his hand along the rusted wheel that controlled the gate, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm. The reservoir stretched wide and still full from recent rains. In the distance, the glow of construction lights buzzed through the dark, outlining the rows of new houses. He whispered into the night, as though his father and grandfather could hear him. "They think I'll just walk away. They don't know me." But even as Roland clung to the land's memory, the system that should have defended him was already closing its doors. If Roland Drexel thought reason and paperwork would protect him, he quickly learned how fragile both could be when stacked against the machinery of bureaucracy. The first step was simple enough: gather his documents. He dusted off his father's old lockbox again, spread the deeds across his kitchen table, and highlighted every line that confirmed his family's ownership. He thought surely, if he showed the right officials these papers, the mistake would be corrected. The next morning, Roland drove into downtown Fayetteville and stepped inside the Cumberland County Register of Deeds office. The building smelled of coffee toner and stale coffee. Behind the counter, a young clerk with earbuds dangling from her shirt looked up lazily. "I need to speak with someone about a land dispute." without looking up from her phone. By the time Roland was directed to an actual official, a middle-aged man named Mr. Collier, his patience was fraying. He laid out the paperwork, tapping his finger against the notarized seal. "This is my land. They're building on it without my consent." Collier glanced at the documents, then at his computer screen. "According to the system here, the land's listed under the Development Authority." Roland's voice rose then. "Your system is wrong. This deed is valid. You see my name right there." Collier sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sir, I understand your frustration. But once development permits are issued, reversing them is complicated. You'll need to file through civil court if you want to challenge it. Meanwhile, they're pouring concrete and putting roofs on my soil." Roland snapped. Collier offered the kind of shrug that spoke, "Louder than words, that's not something we handle here." It was like shouting into a void. Later that week, Roland met with a local attorney, Jeffrey Harlan, whose office sat above a pawn shop. The lawyer flipped through the paperwork. "With tired eyes, you've got a strong case." Harlan said, "But cases like this take time. Months, maybe years. By then those houses will be full." Roland leaned forward. "So they get to steal from me and I have to wait." Harlan held his gaze for a moment. Before answering quietly, "That's how the system works. Mr. Drexel, they build faster than the courts move." Roland slammed his hand against the table. "What good is a deed if nobody respects it?" Harlan didn't answer. Word of Roland's fight spread around town. Instead of support, he found himself isolated. At the grocery store, people whispered when he walked past. At church one Sunday, a long-time acquaintance approached him after service and said, "Roland, maybe it's best to let it go. Times change. You don't want to be the man who holds everything up." "Holds everything up," Roland repeated, stunned. "I'm not holding up progress. I'm holding on to what's mine." The man raised his hands in surrender. "I'm just saying it's not worth the stress." Even his niece Tanya, who had been fiery in the HOA office, tried to reason with him one evening over dinner. "Uncle, I know it's wrong. I know what they're doing is theft. But the courts, the county, they've already decided. Fighting like this could break you down." Roland set his fork down with a heavy clink. "Then let it break me. I'd rather break fighting than bend to them." Tanya studied him, tears brimming in her eyes. "Granddaddy would be proud, but he'd also want you safe. Promise me you won't do something reckless." Roland's silence was answer enough. The days stretched into weeks. He sent certified letters to county commissioners. He met with state representatives who smiled politely but shuffled him along. He even called a local news station, hoping to get a reporter interested. The producer promised to pass the message along. Nobody called back meanwhile. The subdivision grew, asphalt was poured. Street signs erected, mailboxes planted in neat rows. Children played in driveways, while parents wheeled trash bins to the curb. Roland watched it all from his porch, like a man staring through glass at a life stolen from him. The worst came when the notice arrived in his mailbox. It was stamped with the HOA logo. Bold letters read, "Notice of non-compliance." The letter accused him of failing to maintain the appearance of his property in alignment with neighborhood standards. It threatened fines. Roland laughed out loud, a bitter, guttural laugh. He read the letter again and muttered, "First they steal my land. Now they fine me for not mowing it their way." He drove straight to the HOA office. The notice crumpled in his fist, bursting through the door. He slapped it on Marjorie Kelton's desk. "You people take my land, and now you send me fines for not aligning with your neighborhood." Marjorie leaned back, cool as ever. "Mr. Drexel, we are simply asking for cooperation. The community thrives when everyone contributes." Roland's voice was thunder. "I never agreed to your community. This land is mine." Marjorie's smile barely twitched. "Then perhaps it's time you reconsidered whether this was the right place for you." For Roland, it wasn't just a theft anymore. It was humiliation. The system had silenced him. His neighbors dismissed him, and now the very people trespassing on his land dared to dictate how he should live on it. He returned to the dam that evening, standing in the damp grass as twilight set in. The wheel was cool under his palm, the reservoir swollen from steady rains. His grandfather's voice echoed in memory. Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise. But while the court stalled and the official shrugged, the skies above were already changing. And with them, Roland's patience. The spring rains came early that year. Not gentle showers, but steady. Pounding storms that turned the ditches into rivers and filled every low stretch of ground. For Roland Drexel, had always been a blessing. It meant the dam was doing its job, feeding the reservoir, keeping his family's history alive, at every gallon it held. This year, the rain didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like pressure building and pressing. The same way, the water pressed against the rusted gates of the dam. Roland stood there one evening, rain dripping from the brim of his old baseball cap, staring at the swollen reservoir. The water line had risen nearly to the edge, turning brown and restless. His boots sank into the soft earth. As he walked the length of the embankment, his flashlight beam catching bits of debris floating on the surface, the sound was louder than usual. A low roar that vibrated in his chest. He whispered into the rain. They don't see it, they don't care, but they will. The thought scared him as much as it comforted him. He wasn't a violent man, he wasn't reckless. His whole life he played by the rules, worked hard, saved, followed the law, and yet, for the first time, he felt like a man with no rules left to follow. That night he drove into town to meet his old friend, Clarence Boyd, a retired mechanic who'd known Roland since high school. They sat in a booth at a Waffle House, steam rising off mugs of black coffee. Clarence studied Roland's tired face and shook his head. "You're carrying too much anger, brother." Clarence said, "I can see it eating you alive." Roland pushed his cup away. "They've taken everything my family built. I tried the courts, the county, even the press. Nobody listens. Nobody cares. It's like we never existed." Clarence leaned forward. "So what are you thinking of doing?" Roland stared at him, eyes wet with exhaustion. "I'm thinking, maybe it's time they felt what it means to take from me." Clarence's brow furrowed. "Don't talk like that. You're not that man," Roland's voice cracked. "What man am I supposed to be, Clarence? The one who just watches, while strangers wear my grandfather's sweat, under vinyl siding and white picket fences. They've erased us like we will never hear." The waitress came by with a pot of coffee. Breaking the tension, Roland shook his head, declining a refill, and she walked away. Clarence put a heavy hand on his friend's shoulder. "Listen to me, that dam. Your family's dam, it's not just a reservoir. It's power. You open that gate. You can't close what follows." "You hear me?" Roland met his eyes. "Maybe that's the point." Clarence pulled back, searching for words. Finally, he said softly, "Promise me you'll think before you act. You can't fight arrogance with destruction." "It'll swallow you up," Roland didn't answer. Back home, the storm raged through the night. Lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the rows of houses that had sprouted like weeds. Their windows glowed with warm light. Families eating dinner. Kids sprawled in front of televisions. Dogs barking at shadows. Roland stood at his window watching them, his reflection faint in the glass. To them he was invisible, just a bitter old man who couldn't move on. But he wasn't invisible to himself. He was still Isaac's grandson, Victor's son, the heir to every scar and every triumph the Drexels had fought for. On that soil, he wasn't a ghost. He was flesh and blood the next morning. Tanya showed up unannounced. She walked through the kitchen door, her face pale from worry. "Uncle," she said firmly, "I know what you're thinking. Don't, please." There are other ways Roland looked at her, his eyes heavy on the ways. "Show me, Tanya. Show me one door I haven't knocked on. One person who's listened." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't want to lose you to this. You're all I've got left of Granddaddy." Roland stepped closer, cupping her shoulder. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Then you know why I can't let them erase us. If I don't stand, then what was all of his struggle for?" Tanya shook her head, sobbing quietly. "Standing doesn't mean flooding out families. You'll destroy everything." Roland turned away, staring out the window toward the dam. Sometimes, destruction is the only thing that makes people listen. That evening, he walked back down to the embankment. The rain hadn't let up. The wheel that controlled the gates gleamed slick under the storm. His hands hovered over it, trembling. He could hear Clarence's warning, Tanya's pleas, his grandfather's gravely voice, urging him never to surrender. Every sound collided in his mind. Clashing like thunder, his fingers gripped the wheel. The weight of generations pressed through him. He whispered into the storm, "If they won't hear my words, they'll hear my water." But gripping the wheel was one thing. Turning it would be another. And Roland knew that once he crossed that line, there would be no going back. The storm didn't let up for 3 days. Sheets of rain hammered. The rooftops of the new subdivision, beating against freshly painted siding and pooling in driveways that hadn't yet settled. Gutters overflowed, spilling water into yards where sod had only just been laid, and behind it all at the edge of the trees, where the houses gave way to reservoir, the Drexel Dam strained under the weight of a swollen current. Roland Drexel hardly slept. He spent his nights pacing, sitting at the window, then pacing again. The sound of rain against glass followed him everywhere, like a reminder of the decision pressing on his chest. Tanya had called him twice that day. Voice trembling. "Promise me you won't do anything crazy," she pleaded. "I'm just watching the water." He told her uncle, "I mean it. Don't let them drag you down with them." He hung up without answering, ashamed of the thought he couldn't shake. Maybe it wasn't about dragging him down. Maybe it was about bringing them all face to face with what they had stolen. On the third night, Clarence showed up unannounced. They pulled into Roland's gravel driveway, rain slapping his windshield, and found Roland sitting in his truck, with the engine off, staring at the dam through the mist. Roland, Clarence says, he climbed out, jacket pulled over his head. "Don't do this." Roland's voice was hoarse. "I tried everything else. They treat me like I don't exist." Clarence moved closer, speaking over the rain. "You open that gate, and it won't just wash away wood and concrete. It'll wash away you two. They'll throw you in prison. Is that what your father would want?" Roland's hands trembled on the steering wheel. He thought of Isaac, a victor, of the promise whispered into the soil. Each generation had defended. He turned to Clarence, his eyes long. What would they want, Clarence? To watch our land get paved over? To watch strangers build playgrounds where our corn once stood? I'm not destroying what they built. I'm defending it. Clarence shook his head, rain dripping from his chin. Defending is one thing, flooding out families is another. You'll make yourself the villain in their story. Roland's jaw clenched. Hillary wrote me as the villain. Today they ignored my deed. The two men stood there in the rain. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Clarence sighed. Voice heavy, "If you do this, you'll lose me too." I can't stand by. Roland's throat tightened. But he didn't argue. He watched Clarence climb back into his truck, tail lights glowing red through the storm, until they disappeared down the road. Alone again, Roland walked to the dam. The path was muddy, the air electric with the scent of wet soil and ozone. He placed both hands on the rusted wheel, gripping it tight. The metal was slick, cold, unyielding. He thought of Tanya's tears. He thought of Clarence's warning. But more than anything, he thought of his grandfather's voice. Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise. The houses across the field glowed faintly under the storm clouds, warm lights twinkling like stars. Inside, families were safe unaware, eating dinner, drying laundry, settling children into bed. They had no idea. The ground beneath them still belonged to another man. Roland whispered almost like a prayer, "You'll remember me now," with a grunt. He turned the wheel at first. It barely moved, stiff with rust and age. He pushed harder, muscles straining. Rain running down his face. The wheel groaned and shifted inch by inch, and then with a sudden jolt, the gate gave way, water surged forward, spilling through the opening. With a roar that drowned even the thunder, the reservoir rushed into the creek, the current swelling into a torrent that cut through the newly built subdivision. Within minutes, backyards turned into streams. Water rose over sidewalks, lapped against garage doors, swallowed carefully laid flower beds one by one. Porch lights flickered out as the current surged against the power boxes. Roland stood on the embankment, rain pouring over him, watching it all. His chest heaved, but he didn't move. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't gloating. He was just watching as though the flood was speaking, a language only he understood. From the distant, shouts carried through the store. Families scrambled outside. Voices, panicked headlights flicked on as cars tried to back out of driveways, already drowning in water. Roland heard the chaos but didn't flinch. To him, this wasn't chaos. It was truth, the kind no official, no way no smiling neighbor could ignore. He whispered again, this time louder. Now you'll listen. The wheel spun loosely in his hands. The dam fully opened, the water unrelenting. The decision was no longer his. The current had taken over. But as the water tore through streets and driveways, the question remained. What price would Roland pay for the truth? He had forced them all to see. By morning, the subdivision looked nothing like the glossy brochures. Marjorie Kelton once waved around in county meetings. Streets that were supposed to shine with promise were coated in thick mud. Driveways buckled. Fences leaned sideways like tired skeletons. Lawns sodded only weeks before lay torn up in sheets, rolled back like carpet by the surge of water. The new homeowners stumbled through the wreckage, disbelief carved into their faces. A man in sweatpants slushed through knee-deep water, clutching his toddler in one arm and a trash bag of belongings in the other. A woman stood on her porch, sobbing as she watched water seep under her front door, soaking into the living room she had just furnished. Pickup trucks idled on the higher ground, headlights cutting through the mist, their drivers waiting for families to wade up and climb inside. Roland watched from the edge of the trees. His jacket soaked his eyes, bloodshot. He hadn't slept. The wheel on the dam was still open behind him, the current spilling hard into the creek, feeding the disaster below. He wanted to feel relief, but what filled his chest wasn't triumph. It was a quiet, hollow ache. Marjorie arrived just after sunrise, stepping out of a black SUV, with 2 HOA board members at her side. Her pearl earrings still shone, but her composure was cracking. She barked orders at residents, directing them toward the community center at the top of the hill, when she spotted Roland across the field. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She marched straight toward him. "Do you see what you've done?" she hissed, her voice cutting through the rain-soaked morning. Roland's gaze didn't waver. "What I've done or what you refuse to stop?" Marjorie's chest heaved. These people have children. They trusted me. They trusted this neighborhood. And now, she flung her hand toward the flood-soaked houses. Now they're ruined. Roland stepped closer, his boots sinking into mud. "My father planted corn where your houses stand. My grandfather's hands built that dam. You didn't ruin 35 homes, Marjorie. You ruined 70 years of history. And you thought I'd just sit on my porch while you erased us for a moment." Silence hung between them, heavy and sharp. Marjorie's lips parted, but no words came out behind her. A young couple struggled to carry a drenched mattress into the back of a truck. The sound of children crying carried faintly through the wet air. Finally, she whispered, "You've made yourself a criminal." Roland's eyes glistened, not with fear, but with something closer to grief. "Maybe, but at least I made myself visible." Deputies arrived within the hour. Their cruisers crawled down the slick, half-flooded roads, lights flashing against the gray sky. It's me. We need you to come with us. Roland's niece Tanya appeared then, her hair plastered to her cheeks from the rain. She ran toward him, her voice breaking. "Uncle, please don't fight them." Roland looked at her, his expression weary but steady. "I'm not fighting anymore," he held out his wrists, not resisting as the deputy slipped on the cuffs. Around him, neighbors watched from a distance. Some glared, muttering words like crazy and dangerous. Others just stared, unsure whether to hate him or pity him. Marjorie stood apart, arms crossed, her jaw clenched. For once, her polished tone was gone. She had no speech, no slogan, no neat explanation for what had happened. The flood had stripped her too. As the deputy's LED rolled in toward the cruiser, Tanya clutched his arm. "Ye uncle." "Why did you go this far?" Roland paused, looking at her through rain-blurred eyes. Because sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes people only see the truth when it tears through their front door. The deputy guided him forward, and the door shut with a heavy thud. The cruiser rolled slowly up the hill, tires spraying water as it climbed toward the main road. Behind them, families hauled soaked furniture into trucks. Children huddled under umbrellas shivering. The development that was supposed to symbolize growth, the community now stood as a monument to arrogance, and to the power one man still held, and everyone believed he was powerless. But while the houses could be repaired, and the streets repaved, the deeper damage was something no insurance claim could fix. The community's realization that they had built their future on another man's stolen past. The subdivision dried slowly. Insurance adjusters walked the muddy streets in reflective vests, snapping photos of buckled driveways and warped siding, piles of ruined furniture, and waterlogged boxes set at the curb, waiting to be hauled away. The bright promise of Bradford Creek Estates had turned into a cautionary tale, whispered about in hardware stores and diners across Fayetteville. Yet the water's mark wasn't just physical. It ran deeper into the minds of the families who now live with the memory of how fragile their perfect neighborhood really was. They couldn't ignore the truth anymore. They had moved into a place built on another man's legacy, a legacy they dismiss until the flood forced them to reckon with it. Roland Drexel sat in the county jail, his clothes still damp when he was booked. The cell was bare, the air heavy with bleach. Across from him sat another inmate, a wiry man with tired eyes, who studied Roland for a moment before asking, "What they got you in here for?" "Oh, man." Roland exhaled slowly for turning a wheel. The man laughed once, shaking his head. "Must have been one hell of a wheel." Roland didn't explain, he didn't need to. He leaned back against a concrete wall and closed his eyes, letting silence fill the space where anger had once lived. Tanya visited him 2 days later. She pressed her palms against the glass, tears streaking down her cheeks. "They're saying you'll face charges, reckless endangerment, property damage. Some even want to push for terrorism." Uncle Roland picked up the phone, his voice steady through the static of the line. "They can call it what they want. They'll never call it theft, though. Will they? Now when it's the county and the HOA doing the stealing." Her lips trembled. Was it worth it? Roland looked at her for a long time. Finally, he said, "Ask them. Ask the families who bought houses on stolen land if they think it was worth it." At the same time, Marjorie Kelton found herself cornered in ways she hadn't expected. News crews camped outside her office, microphones shoved toward her as they asked, did the HOA knowingly build on disputed land? And what responsibility does the board take for the damage? Her rehearsed lines, "We followed all proper channels, and the community comes first," sounded thinner each time she said them. One reporter pressed harder. If the land wasn't Drexel's, why hasn't the county been able to produce a clean title? Marjorie blinked, her carefully painted smile faltering. For the first time in years, she had no quick answer at a community meeting a week later. The tone had shifted. Families who once looked at Roland as a nuisance now sat in folding chairs, their faces hard in frustration, not just at him, but the HOA that had promised them security. A father named Robert Lanham stood up, his voice sharp. "You told us this was all legal. You told us this land was free and clear. Now our homes are ruined, our kids are scared, and our insurance companies are dragging their feet because the ownership is in question." Where we lied to Marjorie, murmurs spread through the crowd. Marjorie clutched her clipboard. Her knuckles wiped the paperwork was approved. Approved doesn't mean right. Robert snapped. That man ruined us. He told us over and over, and we laughed at him. Maybe we should have listened. The words hung in the room like smoke. Meanwhile, Clarence sat at his kitchen table, the news flickering on the television. He'd known Roland for decades. He'd seen his stubborn streak, his pride. And though Clarence had begged him not to open the dam, a part of him now wondered if Roland had forced the only conversation that could ever make people see. Because what had the flood really done? It hadn't killed anyone. It hadn't destroyed beyond repair. But it had shattered illusions. Illusions that land could be taken without consequence. That history could be paid over without a price. In his cell, Roland thought about that too. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, but he wasn't ashamed either. He knew he'd never be remembered as just a man who tried to stop. In HOA, he'd be remembered as the man who forced his community to face what they didn't want to see. When Tanya visited again, she asked him quietly, "What lesson do you want people to take from this?" Roland pressed his hand against the glass, his eyes soft but unwavering. That progress is in progress. If it erases the people who came before you, respect has to come before development, or else you're just building on sand. And one day the water will remind you who really owns the ground you're standing on. Outside the jail, the rain had stopped. The sky was clear, but for Bradford Creek Estates. The storm hadn't truly passed. It lingered in every muddy footprint, every warped floorboard, every uneasy glance between neighbors, who now wondered if they had been complicit in another man's loss. But whether they admitted it out loud or not, the truth was already etched in their minds. Roland Drexel had forced them to see what they killed. Weeks passed, but the memory of that flood clung to Bradford Creek Estates like mud that couldn't be scrubbed clean. The water had receded. Insurance companies were calculating their payouts, and contractors were already discussing repairs. Yet no one could ignore the silence that hung over the neighborhood. The glossy brochures had promised safety, growth, and comfort instead. The subdivision had become a reminder of arrogance, colliding with history. Roland Drexel's name was on every tongue, at diners in Fayetteville. People argued over him between bites of grits and eggs. Some called him reckless, a criminal who had endangered families. Others called him a man who'd finally snapped after being pushed too far. But whether they loved him or hated him, they all agreed on one thing. They could no longer pretend he didn't exist. Marjorie Kelton, once a polished face of progress, had grown quieter. The local paper ran an editorial questioning the HOA's authority and the county's complicity. At a town council meeting, a commissioner who had once brushed Roland off admitted, "We failed to respect due process." Those words, thin as they were, carried weight, because they never would have been spoken if not for the flood inside his cell. Roland didn't care about newspaper articles or council apologies. What mattered to him were the visits from Tanya. She came every Sunday carrying books, bringing him updates from the outside. During one visit, she told him that some families were leaving Bradford Creek altogether. They say they don't feel right living there anymore, she said softly, pressing her hand against the glass. Roland nodded slowly. Good. Maybe that land will rest a little. Tanya's eyes filled with tears. "Uncle, I don't want this to be the way people remember you." Roland smiled faintly. Better this than forgotten. Better they say my name in anger than erase it in silence. She pressed her forehead to the glass. I just wish there had been another way. Roland leaned forward, his voice steady. So do I, but sometimes when no one listens. The water speaks louder than words. Out in the community, that truth settled like sediment. Families still try to repair what they had lost, but the subdivision never felt the same. At block parties, conversations carried tension. Parents who once boasted about their investments now avoid eye contact when the subject of Roland came up. And Marjorie, still wearing her pearls, still trying to hold her posture, could no longer command the same respect. Residents whispered behind her back, questioning whether she had LED'd them into disaster. Clarence visited Tanya one evening, sitting on her porch as the sun dipped low. Your uncle. He forced the question no one wanted to ask. What's more valuable, the ground we stand on, or the people who claimed it before us? Tanya nodded quietly. He made them see, even if they hate him for it. He made them see the moral was clear, though no one wanted to say it outright. Progress built on theft isn't progress at all. It's a facade as fragile as drywall against a flood. And Roland had torn that facade apart with one decision, one turn of a wheel. That echoed louder than decades of ignored words. For Roland, legacy wasn't measured in money or property value. It was measured in memory, in the stubborn insistence that his grandfather's sweat and his father's struggle would not vanish under vinyl siding. He had lost his freedom, but in that loss, he had carved his family's name into the conscience of a community that once pretended he didn't matter. And maybe that's the lesson here. Not just for Bradford Creek Estates, not just for Fayetteville, but for all of us, respect isn't optional. History isn't disposable. You can't build a future worth living in. If you erase the people who came before you, if you watch this far, ask yourself, what would you have done in Roland's place? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have turned the wheel, knowing the risk, knowing the cost, but refusing to let your legacy be stolen in plain sight? That's the weight of this story. A man who stood alone, ignored, and dismissed, until he made himself impossible to forget. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about justice, legacy, and what it means to fight for what's yours, don't forget to subscribe, because stories like Roland's remind us that the past isn't gone. It waits for someone to defend it, and sometimes that someone has to be you, because when the water speaks, the whole world listens. Imagine standing on the land where your grandfather bled to protect, watching strangers build 35 homes, paving over everything you hold dear. Every polite letter brushed you off, every door slammed in your face, every offer made you feel invisible. For months, Roland Drexel, a 58-year-old landowner, was dismissed as just another relic of a forgotten past. His name spoken only in whispers, his claim to the land disregarded by those who saw it as a chance for profit. But Roland knew something they didn't. Behind the rows of freshly staked lots, behind the bulldozers and surveyors, stood the dam. Not just a crumbling piece of infrastructure, but a symbol of resilience, of legacy, of everything his family had fought for since the 1940s. It wasn't just about crops and water. It was about identity, history, and the promise that no one could take what belonged to them. As construction crews tore up the land, Roland stood silent, fists clenched, until one stormy night when something snapped within him. He turned the wheel on that dam, a simple action with devastating consequences. The water, once carefully controlled, surged across streets and foundations that hadn't even existed weeks before. It wasn't thunder that rattled the foundations. It was the roar of a man finally stepping into his power. The storm Roland unleashed wasn't just physical. It was a statement. In a world where the voices of marginalized are often drowned out, Roland stood tall, fighting not only for himself, but for every person who had been denied the right to protect their legacy. The land was never just dirt and crops to him. It was the embodiment of his family's sweat and sacrifice. The place where his grandfather had faced down racial prejudice, built a life from the ground up, and carved out a legacy that now faced destruction. Marjorie Kellerton, the HOA president with her polished smile and corporate tone, had dismissed Roland as a nuisance. She'd seen his land as an opportunity for development, a chance to expand the suburbs. But she'd forgotten one thing: the dam still belonged to Roland. And when he used that dam to expose the truth, the floodwaters became a powerful symbol of justice. In a town that had long whispered that families like his didn't belong, Roland's stand became a message to everyone who had been overlooked, exploited, and forgotten. He wasn't fighting just for the past. He was fighting for the future, for a world where legacy, fairness, and truth mattered more than power and greed. As the floodwaters tore through the new developments, tearing down the walls of greed and corruption, Roland wasn't just a man who fought for his land. He became the hero of justice, a man who refused to be silenced, refused to be erased. His battle for his land was no longer just a personal fight. It was a beacon of resistance against an unjust system that sought to trample over the voices of those who fought to hold on to their place in the world. Roland Drexel's story isn't just about reclaiming land. It's about reclaiming justice. And when the world turns its back, sometimes the only way to make your voice heard is to turn the wheel of the dam and let the floodwaters of change wash over everything. In this version, Roland becomes a beacon of justice, a man who stands up for what's right in the face of overwhelming odds, and through his actions, he transforms into a hero of justice.